cultural and scientific trends that have defined the Western world for 5 centuries is now leading in new directions. What were the ideals that define the Western world? We are now saying that's old business. We're now moving in some new direction. They go on to say the primary purpose of social studies is to help young people develop the ability to make informed and reasoned decisions. Who gets to define informed and reasoned decisions? For the public good as citizens of a culturally diverse, democratic society in an interdependent world. Now, this is all marketing gobbledygook that has real meaning underneath it. Sounds bad to you and I who are a little more in tune than the rest of the world into what this stuff really means. But keep in mind, we spent millions of focused market research to come up with the language to mask the agenda. The agenda is exposed by looking at the curriculum. But first I want to play a little video clip of the senior director of the Mid-Continental Regional Education Laboratory in 1989 as she revealed to the National Governors Association the agenda for education. She's going to list 3 important aspects of what education is about. Listen to for the 3.
It seems to me that far too much of our efforts have been focused on the issue of let's find a short-term fix and fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation in the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society. And the issue for most children and the issues for the society is that what has changed in education today is that we no longer see the teaching of facts and information as the primary outcome of education. During the past 10 years, we've been going through a reform movement. And that reform movement began with the governors of the nation, and basically what their concern was that they began to understand the very close relationship between economic development and human capital.
Did you catch the 3 parts? Number 1, the total transformation of society. Number 2, facts and information, knowledge, is no longer the primary purpose of education. And number 3, the close connection between economic, let's call it sustainable development, and human capital, that is labor, human resource labor for a planned economy. Now, it shouldn't surprise you then to see this information in the Minnesota 72 plan. She said we've been working on this for over a decade. That was in 89. It goes back at least to 79. I have information that goes back to 1933, folks. It says environmental education is a new way of thinking. It is a lifelong process. How many have heard the term lifelong learning? It goes on to say that it requires basic cultural changes and the responsibilities must be shared by governments, schools, and businesses. Now, the way this is being done is through something called public-private partnerships. We've heard a little bit of that term. But this is a public-private partnership between government, education, and the economy or business. Reinventing government, education, and business. Now, the interesting thing to ask here is, what happens when you're in partnership with an 800-pound gorilla? The purpose of the other partners is to feed the gorilla. And that is, in fact, what is happening and what we're seeing taking place. Now, the first piece was Goals 2000 that finalized the plan, that changed the purpose of education in content. I often say there's only 2 problems with education. It's content and its structure. We fix those 2 things and we fix education. The content piece came through Goals 2000. That locked the entire curriculum. It gave us a national curriculum, a national test, a national teacher's licensing rule that all 50 states signed on to merely because of the promise of grant money. The second piece was School to Work, also passed in '94. School to Work created the partnership between education and the economy. Knowledge is now derived at structurally what the planners will see the future economic needs are going to be and retrofit our children into specific career clusters. How many have heard the term career clusters? The schools here in Maine are being restructured as well. They were one of the 10 pilot states along with Minnesota. By the way, under No Child Left Behind, they have now renamed career clusters smaller learning communities. Doesn't that sound nice? Nice. And those are the grants now that your districts are applying for to help implement the same system. Now the third piece is less known. That is the Workforce Investment Act. That created the state and federal boards, and it created the local investment boards in the various regions of your state to manage the whole thing. Now this Workforce Investment Act, the only thing I want to say about it is it brought in a new term that you need to understand: appointed representatives. Now think about that a minute. The boards are made up of appointed representatives of business, representatives of teachers, representatives of parents, representatives of labor, representatives. The boards are by law have to be 51% business representative, but they're all appointed. You see, in a free society, those groups should get to vote and elect their own representation. In a government tyranny, representatives are appointed to represent your interests. Read your documents. I found it all over Maine. All over Maine. Every single one of your boards, whether it's the sustainability boards, anything, is appointed representation. That alone is worthy of exposure. Now let's move on. No Child Left Behind locked the entire thing in place at the pretense of sunsetting Goals 2000 and School to Work. Keep in mind, Goals 2000 and School to Work were originally passed with sunset dates. They were just a little late in sunsetting them. Think of it this way. It takes 2 booster rockets to get the shuttle in orbit. Once the shuttle is in orbit, they can reject or sunset their boosters. Now all you need is to maintain orbit. No Child Left Behind is maintaining orbit of the shuttle of this system. It is the accountability measures put in place to ensure every state complies. Now here's one of the ways that all 3 pieces of the Goals 2000 School to Work Workforce Investment Act are all part of a single plan. You can't assume they're different ideas. They are all part of a single unit plan. Now, No Child Left Behind, again, as I say, pretends to sunset this. But let me show you how it enforces the national curriculum. It says that the standards are voluntary. We all heard the term voluntary national standards for so long. Well, No Child Left Behind mandates that districts will be held accountable to the nation's report card, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Secondly, they tell us that the National Assessment Governing Board's policy mandates that the content of NAEP reflect voluntary national standards. Folks, when you mandate something that's voluntary, it's no longer voluntary. Right? Voluntary now means mandatory. Change your dictionaries. That's what it now means. Let's move on. Now, I'm going to go through the 3 parts of Shirley McCune's, and I'm going to go through them in reverse. First, the economic connection to education. This is our Minnesota State education document that explains the 3 circles of this system. Note, it is education reform tied to workforce preparation aimed at economic development. Look at the center, the 3 words in the center, school to work. School to work is the nut that holds the whole radical thing together. Now that has now been replaced with a new term, workforce investment boards. Isn't that convenient in the official documents? But it says that what it means for education is education now is to be keyed to one's ultimate life and work goals. Well, how do you know that? How can you shape someone's ultimate life and work goals through education unless somebody has determined your ultimate life and work goals? You see, in a free society, education is supposed to be a broad-based liberal arts education to prepare for whatever the future holds. This system says, we alone know what the future is, and we're going to retrofit you with what you need to meet those needs. That's the difference between the 2 systems of freedom and tyranny. Now, the document goes on to say that school to work is a whole new way of thinking, a revolutionary approach that will recreate these concepts. Now, when I say it's a revolution, I'm called a conspiracy wacko in Minnesota. Well, I'll tell you what, that's because I'm a property. When I say it's a revolution, I'm called a conspiracy wacko in Minnesota. Well, I'll tell you what, that's because I'm a property rights guy, okay? That's what makes me radical. You know, the real radical writers are the Rockefeller Republicans who are helping put this whole system into place too. The new mission of education in Minnesota states to create a seamless system of education and workforce preparation for all learners tied to the needs of a competitive marketplace. Notice it does not say free marketplace. China has a competitive economic market. They compete with us in the economic system. What's missing in China is freedom. You will not see the term free market anymore in any government document that's tied into this system. You will not. I can't find it. The only time I've ever seen it is in the history standards when they're talking about what has been. The new term is competitive economic marketplace. You don't have to be free to compete in a state-planned economy. This is our blueprint, and it tells us that based on federal and state research where job growth is anticipated, St. Paul secondary schools will consider 6 career clusters as the focus of their small learning environments. Now, in Minnesota's northwest region, this translates to taconite. So we're advertising people going into taconite mining production. That's the first mining step towards the production of steel. And they advertise with taxpayer dollars. Would you like to earn $65,000 per year in wages and benefits? Go into taconite. And all these high school kids are saying, hey, that sounds pretty easy for 65 grand. You know what the problem is? Right now, northwest corner of Minnesota has 30,000 laid off taconite production workers who'd love to be earning $65,000. This is government planning 101. Doesn't work. In fact, you can see here on the government's own projection that taconite is a dying industry in Minnesota. But what do we really need? Burger flippers. You see, we need labor for service industry now. But this source is the same source that gave us the taconite brochure. You see, in a state-planned economy, the left hand often doesn't know what the other left hand is doing. They're confused. It doesn't work. Can you imagine if you were able to predict this kind of future to retrofit your children for the future needs, how brilliant you'd be at the market? You know, these folks can't even get that right. How are they going to retrofit our children for what they perceive the future needs are? I want you to hear, though, how the left really believes they know the future. This is State Senator Steve Murphy.
What we're seeing right now is that about 80% of all the jobs that we're going to have in the future, you're going to need some sort of technical expertise. About 20% of the jobs in the future will require some sort of 4-year education or beyond. We're talking the doctors, the lawyers, the administrators, the engineers, those types that are changing are in the labor pool. The people that are actually doing the work, people call it menial labor. I don't. You know, the people that work in factories, people that use their sweat and toil, you're going to be splicing wires for AT&T or whoever. And that's where the majority of the jobs are going to be in the future. And we need to have our students aware of that so that they don't make bad decisions after high school.
Can you believe what you're hearing? He knows the future. And the concept here is it's a waste of state resources to train someone beyond their station in life. This concept came out of the polytechnical system, by the way, of Eastern Europe. This was the idea that the state will train you for your specific station in life. Now, the best education was reserved for the kings and queens' children, those who would one day grow up and rule the nation. You see, the problem is, in America, we're supposed to be a self-governing nation. All of our children are the princes and princesses who will one day grow up to rule this nation. And they deserve that broad-based liberal arts academic education, whether they're a truck driver or a doctor and lawyer. Thank you very much, Steve Kelly. This is where we're at in the name of educational progress.
What we're seeing right now.
Now, we call this the Knowledge Society. Peter Drucker, how many have heard of Peter Drucker? The New Business and the Guru Industry. What book they don't talk to you too much about is his book, Post-Capitalist Society, where he explains that in order to move from capitalism to a knowledge society, which by the way is marketing language for a labor society, education in the post-capitalist society has to permeate the entire society, business, government. You recognize the pattern of the triangle. Post-capitalist societies, he says, requires lifelong learning. That term, by the way, was first coined by Vladimir Lenin. Lifelong education through the polytechnical system was his philosophy of education. Now, this is our recent document. This is just put out by the Republicans in 2002. This, of course, once again, says putting it all together, and of course has the three-circle graphic right on the front as puzzle pieces. And it explains to us that the bottom line here of the outcome indicators, call it outcome-based government, is to finally get down to something called sustainable family income. Now, this has to do with the transference of wealth. It's simply not fair if somebody has more wealth than another. So we're going to define the terms of a sustainable income, and government will be in charge of giving that to you. The document actually says, never lose sight of equity. Remember the new definition of equity that was put up on the board by one of the previous Michaels? In our collective efforts to increase the overall economic vitality of Minnesota, we must not lose sight of equity or fairness based on need. Do you recognize that term, by the way? From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. I'm going to give you a peek ahead to the curriculum, because this is what they're teaching the children in second grade. The entire purpose of second grade social studies is to transfer loyalty from the family to the government and teach them about sustainable economic consumption. Needs and wants is what they call it. What are needs and wants? Well, it says here that needs are basic needs that all people must have. Wants are things people would like to have, but they can do without. The concept here, as it grows up fully in the entire scope and sequence, is it's not fair for you to have your wants met until the entire world has its needs met. This is sustainable economic outcome-based government redistribution of wealth philosophy. Growing up a little farther into 7th grade, it becomes gross national product in the global government or the global economy. This is out of a Macmillan mainstream 7th grade textbook. Although the countries of the world are all linked by interdependence, not all of them share equally in the world's riches. Well, who's hogging all the wealth in this map that is based on size depending on gross national product? You see, this is a Marxist concept of the economy, that there is only a finite amount of wealth in the world and we have to share equally. The problem is, in a free society, wealth is created and grows and expands. But this is not the sustainable economy. Which, just like the environment wants to suppress development, the sustainable economy wants to suppress the creation of wealth to be managed through our human resource generation workforce investment councils. By the way, like I said, Minnesota is one of the states on the cutting edge. So was Texas, so is Maine. And this is fully embedded in the Maine education system. The book explains that Maine also is designing a school-to-work system offering structured technical training pathways for young people. Here's the quote that gives you the 80-20 that you heard our senator say. It's all the same. Every state has the same talking points. And then your governor goes on to tell us that the residents of Maine are increasingly aware that our education system must prepare students to meet unprecedented society and economic demands. To do so, all students must have the knowledge, skills, attitudes that are outlined in Maine's Common Core of Learning. And as you all well know, that is now called learning results. It's all the same thing. It's just repackaged under each new administration to make you think there's a new plan. It's all the same. And it's exactly the same in every state I've ever been in research. It takes me 5 minutes to research a state because I know what I'm looking for, and I can find it so easy. By the way, that's all I'm going to deal with the School to Work system. Our video that is Senator Michelle Bachmann and I is Guinea Pig Kids, available here or at our website at edwatch.org. Moving on, the transformation of education at edwatch.org. Moving on, the transformation of education. Education for a sustainable future requires a change in approach in the teaching and learning process. This brings us to number 2, and that is the idea that preparing American youth for the 21st century requires a radical departure from traditional classroom instruction. Above all, it requires a shift in long-held beliefs that the role of the teacher is to transmit knowledge to the students. Instead, teachers must view themselves as facilitators through which young people construct knowledge themselves. Now, that's a long way of saying indoctrination. But the problem is, this came out in 1989, by the way, by the Carnegie Council on Adolescent Development, and is the plan now for our education system. The research link that I use is out of our State Department of Education, who did a research on performance-based instruction called constructivism. It tells us, basically constructivism means postmodernism. There is no truth. Students construct their own understandings of reality and realize that objective reality is not knowable. So why bother? The truth is, the truth which keep men free is being suppressed in order to prop up the attitude training agenda. And it moves on. You can see this through the final subject to fall by the national standards is education. This is our new math in Minnesota called Connected Mathematics. Based on the National Center of Teachers of Mathematics, Standard 3 tells us that students learn that mathematics is man-made, that it is arbitrary, and good solutions are arrived at by consensus. No lie. There is no truth, not even in math. Most of us assume 2 + 2 is always going to equal 4. You're wrong. We might reach a new consensus. Consensus is the theme that is more important in math than math. Now keep in mind, this is based on a shift in worldview. Mathematics was not a self-existing truth discovered by man and the secrets of it unlocked. It was a social construction to meet society's need. This is the shift in thinking about all of our curriculum today. They're all based on the postmodern or constructivist approach. How well does it work? Well, they tell you. In the teacher's guide in the back, it tells us that because the curriculum doesn't emphasize arithmetic computations done by hand, some students may not do as well on tests assessing computational skills. We believe such a trade-off in the favor of CMP is very much to the student's advantage in the world of work. You see, we don't want children who can think about the numbers behind the buttons. We simply want children to be prepared to know which buttons to push. That's why the new cash registers at the fast food have pictures on them, not numbers. Our children are mathematically illiterate on purpose. How do I know on purpose? Why isn't this just a basic bad idea? Because the Sustainable Development Plan tells us so. Generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. Charlotte Iserby, I owe you an apology. I did not believe for the longest time it was a deliberate dumbing down. I thought the dumbing down was a natural consequence of a bad idea. Folks, it's deliberate. It's deliberate. So UNESCO tells us, indeed, in the 21st century, the literacy of sustainable development will be as essential to comprehending the world as were, past tense, the traditional skills of reading and writing at the start of the 20th century. Folks, this is real. It's happening to our children as we sit here every day day in and day out. Goes on to say the effectiveness must ultimately be measured by the degree to which ESD changes the attitudes and behaviors of people, both in their individual roles and in their collective responsibilities and duties as citizens. And so we see the truth of this matter in a picture that was sent to us at Maple River Education Coalition. This central school model says the aim of education is the knowledge not of facts, but of values. And in fact, we were given this at a school to work conference put on by the state of Minnesota, defining performance-based instruction, which by the way is just a new term for outcome-based instruction, which said that learning has not taken place until behavior has changed. Goes on to tell you that values, attitudes, and interests can be learned and taught, and they can be objectively evaluated. How do you do that unless somebody knows the outcome attitudes that are desired? Well, the way we measure that is through something called an assessment. Has anybody heard the term assessments? You ever wonder why they changed that term instead of test? You see, the thing is, test is a measure of objective knowledge. What do we assess? We assess our houses for its value. We assess our cars for its value. Folks, we are now assessing our children based on their value, perceived value to society, based on how well they now demonstrate that they think like a globalist. That's the meaning of assessment. That's what we're doing to our children. Now, No Child Left Behind made it a federal offense for me to show you the NAEP test, so I can't do that anymore. But what I will show you is the results from this National Center for Education Statistics document that assessed the percentage of children who now believe it's government's responsibility to take on economic concerns. Keeping prices under control. 84.2% of America's ninth graders now believe it's government's responsibility to set prices. The curriculum is working. Providing industries with the support they need to grow. Supporting business. 66.2%. The curriculum is working. Guaranteeing a job for anyone who wants one. Government's responsibility. The curriculum is working. And finally, reducing differences in income and wealth among people. 63.5% of ninth graders, tomorrow's citizens, voters, and government officials now believe it is government's responsibility to redistribute wealth. The curriculum is working. It tells us that the assessments were not designed to measure knowledge of a particular country's government, but were developed instead to measure knowledge and understanding of key principles that are universal across democracies. Are these the key principles of democracy? I think not. Not the American version of a republic, by the way. Read Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. Guaranteeing a republican form of government, not a democracy. John Adams called democracy the devil's very own form of government because he said the most famous democratic vote in all of history was crucify Christ. And the government even knew he was innocent. That's democracy. That's why our founders were afraid of it. Who was the first man to call for worldwide democracy? Karl Marx. Did you know that? Well, how could kids think this way? Look at the national standards of economic curriculum. By the way, the voluntary mandatory national standards. Standard 16 says, students will understand that there is an economic role for government to play. Governments often define and protect property rights. Ooh, there's a tricky one. See, they got the word protect in there, but who defines the property rights? Government. If government defines property rights, there is no such thing as private property. Most government policies also redistribute income. This is true, but it's supposed to be a good thing here. Who wrote these standards? Well, the National Council on Economic Education and the Economics International program. These were to be based on a consensus process. Well, again, how can ninth graders be so easily convinced? You know, a famous man named Lenin once said, take away a people's heritage and they're easily persuaded. Easily persuaded. So the very first subject that fell was history. The National History Standards tells us one of the most common problems is the compulsion students feel to find the one right answer. Or worse yet, they rush to closure reporting back a self-evident truth.
Start our second session this afternoon. You heard this morning about all the plans to transform your communities and rob your property and rip your whole communities apart in the name of sustainable development and smart growth. The question has been asked many times how the people who are perpetrating these things expect to do this and make it last when you have a nation of people who were raised and educated on individual rights and the Constitution and so forth. The answer to that is that you steal a generation of children and you indoctrinate them so that they accept these ideas and they become global citizens in the coming global village. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about here this afternoon. Michael Chapman is an educational researcher and an author. He is also a member of the board of the Maple River Education Coalition and founder of the American Heritage Research. Through research and study, the Maple River Coalition is finding a direct link between the restructuring of our schools through federal programs like Goals 2000 and School to Work, and the restructuring of our communities through sustainable development. Michael Chapman and his group have discovered that today, as revealed in the National Curriculum Standards, education is no longer about preparing our children to maintain true liberty in a sovereign America. Instead, it is about indoctrinating our children to accept citizenship in a future global village. Today, Michael Chapman comes to us from Minnesota to reveal how the so-called standards movement masks the true agenda to a radically transformed America. Please welcome Michael Chapman.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you all for sitting in this long. It's been a long day, and you've heard some great speakers. You know, I couldn't help but sitting back in the back of the room listening to Michael Shaw and Michael Kaufman and some of the local folks. I was back there just rapidly adding stuff to my presentation, trying to figure out what can I take out now to make room for it. So I'm really going to move fast. I'm very graphically intense on my presentation, so you'll want to be somewhere where you can see this board. I want you to know that we in Minnesota consider ourselves members of the People's Republic of Minnesota. And for Michael Shaw's benefit, of course, that's the Midwest version of the left coast. But realistically, Minnesota was the very first state in the nation, in fact, the only state in the nation to sign the Declaration of World Citizenship back in 1971. Now, this was the same year that the EPA was instituted. And by the way, the gentleman who was the first head of the EPA was a man named William Ruckelshaus, who was the American ambassador to the World Commission on Environment and Development. So there's a lot of dots being connected through these things, and I'm going to connect the education dot for you. Now, I just want to go on to say that the state of Minnesota actually, as declared in this document, actually flew the UN flag over the state capitol building. Now, the citizens went ape. Here's actually a newspaper article showing that flag. The citizens went ape, so it wasn't too surprising that a year later we came out with the first environmental education plan. This is it. Now, one of the speakers I travel around the state speaking with is now a senator in Minnesota, so I got this document from her. I asked her if she could get a copy of it out of the archives at the Capitol, and sure enough, she did. She also sent me a copy of the original Declaration of World Citizenship that includes signatures. What you'll find out is from every single leader in politics in the state of Minnesota. Both House and Senate minority and majority leaders, our representatives, everyone. Hubert Humphrey signed this thing. Everybody signed this thing, thinking this was a wonderful thing. So it's not too surprising that the paper was all behind this and quoted George Bush, the country's new UN ambassador, said this: "It is President Nixon's deeply held conviction, which I share completely, that the whole UN system must be strengthened in the field of peace and security, social and economic development." Now keep in mind, before the term sustainable development was in vogue, that was a marketing term that cost the taxpayers millions of dollars to come up with in order to mask what this really is. This has been in our curriculum since then, and it's been nationally in our curriculum since 1994, every single classroom in America. In fact, I have challenged teachers as I travel around to say, show me any textbook, any subject, any grade, any page, and I will show you blatant propaganda meant to transform this nation. Lincoln once said, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will become the philosophy of government in the next. We are reaping the consequences of having turned a generation of children over to this new system. It's not too surprising then that UNESCO, in their September 2003 conference on education for a sustainable future, came out and declared 2005 to 2015 the decade of education for sustainable development. You will be hearing this term everywhere you go from now on for the next 10 years. Education for sustainable development. And surprise, surprise, they named UNESCO the lead agency for that effort, who said their goal is to integrate sustainable development into all levels of education in order to promote education as a key agent for change. Now, what does that mean? If you go to the UNESCO's website on education for sustainable development, you will find out the new role of education. They state, Chapter 36 of Agenda 21 embraces all ways in which people learn about the world around them, develop the values and lifestyles, and assume their responsibilities as global citizens to prepare for the future. Now that's why I title my talk, Preparing Our Children for Global Citizenship. It is the right term, it is the right definition for the marketing word, sustainable development. And it encompasses more than just environment, as you've heard so far. They go on to say education is the primary agent of transformation towards sustainable development. At the U.S., at the cost to the taxpayers of quite a bit of a $400,000 grant, I believe it was, we have developed the toolkit for education for sustainable development. And I apologize, I covered up the slide with the box that shows the economy, the society, and the environment as the three parts of this system, as you saw, I think it was Michael Shaw in the three-circle graphic. It says, from the time sustainability was first, sustainable development was first endorsed at the UN General Assembly in '87, again, this document, the parallel concept of education to support sustainable development has been explored. That's a lie. It has been fully embedded in our curriculum in Minnesota since 1968. It's been fully embedded in the curriculum in the entire country since 1994. I'll show you how that works. But they go on to say that it will encompass the 40 chapters of Agenda 21. That is your federal national curriculum, the 40 chapters. Now chapter 36 deals with education, but it is to encompass the principles contained in all 40 chapters. The toolbox goes on to tell you, by the way, this was written in July 2002, so it's fairly recent. Goes on to tell you that world citizenship is the goal. And world citizenship encompasses the constellation that is all the principles, values, attitudes, and behavior that the people of the world must embrace if sustainable development, i.e. global citizenship, is to be realized. Now, this is a bureaucratic revolution in education. The prime bureaucracy is the U.S. Department of Education, which was instituted in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter as a promise to put the principles of sustainable development in place before the term was coined. But this was the entire purpose of the U.S. Department of Education, now I believe the world's largest employer. Under its direction is the Office of Education Research and Improvement. They oversee the 10 regional education laboratories. You can go to their website and see these are the 10 regions of the U.S., and each region has a director and a directorate to be responsible for each piece. Now, it was the Mid-Continental Regional Education Laboratory, which recently changed their name, that was in charge of putting together the national curriculum. They called it the standards-based movement. This, for instance, is the social studies curriculum that states that it is clear that the dominant